You're listening to Hooked on Creek, a podcast celebrating the music, history, and fans of the best band in the land, the legendary Max Creek. I am your host, Korre Johnson, and this is episode 45.
I know that you're waiting patiently. Yes, it seems like a waste of time. We see you wait from me. You understand that I can hold your hand and still be free.
Hello, and welcome back to Hooked on Creek. This is a very special episode because I have the pleasure of introducing you to Tom Flanagan. Tom is a writer, a storyteller, a music lover, and a huge fan of Max Creek. Tom is also a published author. His books include Acapulco and The Potato Puff Surprise. And now Tom is writing a new book, and this one is entirely focused on Max Creek. In this episode, you're going to hear all about Tom's new book, where he's at in the writing process, and what inspired him to take on this project. I think all of us, as fans of Max Creek, want this band's legacy to get the recognition and documentation it deserves. That's why I'm so grateful Tom is writing this book, and why I'm so excited to share our conversation with you. As a reminder, if you have feedback about this episode, or if you have ideas for future episodes, head over to hookedoncreek.com and click the contact link to send me a message. All right, now let's get started. Tom Flanagan, welcome to Hooked on Creek.
Hey, thanks, Korre. It's good to be here.
Tom, I understand you were born and raised in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, but you currently live in Fort Collins, Colorado. And at some point in time during your youth, you became exposed to the music of Max Creek. And now, as an adult, you are writing a book about Max Creek. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I grew up in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and born and raised in New England. And much to my parents' chagrin, I saw Max Creek every single Wednesday night at the living room in Providence, Rhode Island, on Providence Street, the Big Bubble. It had this big bubble on the side of the building. And boy, what a time to be alive, and what a time to see the band. And so throughout high school, I would see Max Creek the minimum of once a week. I mean, I was probably seeing the band, 6 to 8 times a month. And so was really spoiled in the late 80s and early 90s.
Growing up and seeing Max Creek at the living room, tell me about that venue. What was it like to be in that space watching Max Creek?
Yeah, it was, I like to call it an infamous venue. It was really fantastic. They had amazing bands play. And so there was actually 3 locations. The first one, I was too young to go to. It was in downtown Providence. The second one was on Promenade Street. And that was sort of when I discovered Max Creek, and I was in high school, and there were just so many incredible concerts. And so I saw Fish there for the first time, their first time playing Rhode Island. I saw the Red Hot Chili Peppers. I would see Roomful of Blues. There was just so much amazing music back in the late 80s and early 90s. And it was owned by a gentleman named Randy. And it was interesting. I didn't know this at the time, and I've sort of discovered this writing the book. He was really sort of a community leader in Rhode Island. He lived in a town called Cumberland, Rhode Island, and, coached the Little League Baseball. And he actually took multiple teams to the Little League World Series, was on ESPN. Just a really great community guy. And every band I speak to, musicians just loved him. He really bent over backwards to make sure the band was taken care of. At one point, I think his wife or family member was cooking band's dinner. And unfortunately, he died prematurely. He was hit and struck by a vehicle. It was really unfortunate. And so there's actually a baseball field named after him in Cumberland, Rhode Island. And so, but anyways, he owned 3 versions of the living room. They pretty much closed down after he passed. And the third living room, certainly not as nice as the previous one, but some just amazing shows. And I mean, these were sold out shows on a weekly basis, and the band just performed so well back then.
Yeah. Tom, I really want to learn about this book. What is this book about Max Creek. Tell me about it.
Sure. So, not to be dramatic, but it's very important for me that the band's legacy is preserved for future generations. And that's why I'm such a big fan of Hooked on Creek, because it's doing the same thing, right? And I'm an avid reader, and I'm always disappointed when I read books about the jam band scene, particularly in the late 80s or early 1990s, and there's little to no mention of Max Creek. And so that always sort of disappoints me, and I want to change that. So I live in Fort Collins, as you mentioned, which is 1 hour north of Denver. And a few years ago, the band announced that they were playing two shows in Denver, which I was really excited about because I figured that would probably be my last chance to see the band. I mean, they've been playing for 50 years. I live in Colorado now and I don't get to see the band. And so I was super excited for the announcement. And so I obviously purchased tickets as soon as they went on sale. And then unfortunately, the shows were canceled numerous times due to the pandemic. And so I was pretty bummed. I was like, man, if this was the last time I ever had a chance to see Creek and it was canceled due to the pandemic, I was just going to be totally bummed. But luckily, the shows happened and they played two shows last May and they were fantastic. And I was so impressed with how tight the band was, how well they performed. And it was just two amazing shows. And so I'm driving home after the show back to Fort Collins, and I was like, I need to brush up on my Max Creek stuff. Went online and was saddened to see that there weren't any books available or any books written about Max Creek. And myself being a professional writer and a lifelong fan, I said, I'm going to change that. And so I reached out to the band, and luckily they were all for it.
What was their reaction? Do you remember when you first got in touch with them? Like, were they, who are you and what do you want to do?
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting story. So I went to the shows with a friend of mine who lives in Boulder. And interestingly enough, when we went to the shows, his neighbor was there, and his neighbor was the booking agent for Live Nation who had booked the shows. I was chatting with him and chatting about Max Creek and, how I grew up seeing the band. And so he loved those stories. And so after that, I reached out to my friend. I was like, this is kind of a crazy idea, but could you put me in touch with the band's management? I want to pitch them the idea of the book. And I'm just paraphrasing now, but I think their manager got back to me and said something to the effect of, Tom, it's my job to, put things in requests in front of the band, but this is probably not something they're interested in. It's not something they focus on. It's not in their wheelhouse. But thank you for contacting me and thank you for your interest. And I was like, well, at least I tried. I had a good idea and I pitched it. And so, so be it. And then literally the next day, Mark Mercia emailed me back and he completely remembered me from back in the day, and which was wonderful. He's one of the nicest people I've ever met. And he said, Tom, let's do it. So like within a day, he's like, the band supports this. Let's begin the process. Let's set up some interviews. And so I haven't looked back since then. It was just an amazing sort of string of events that happened.
And where are you in the overall process of writing this book? Are you more towards the beginning, the middle, or the end?
Yeah, so from a writer's standpoint, it's an interesting sort of project. So I am simultaneously writing the book and researching it. And so the research process has been a little intriguing. It's sort of been fascinating. So I've interviewed band members, past and present. I've interviewed crew members and super fans as well. And it's one of these projects where the more I learn, the more questions I have, which has sort of been really fascinating. And there's been things I've uncovered that I was like, wow, that wasn't in my initial draft of the book, but this is such a wonderful topic. I have to explore it more. And just to give you an example, I've had the opportunity to interview Linda. And Linda was sort of like the next member of the band. She was sort of the Chris Kuroda of Max Creek, if you will. She did lights for decades for the band. She did merchandise. She did most of the covers and the designs for Max Creek studio albums. So when you look at something like 1990 or one of the great studio albums, Windows, whatever the case may be, Linda did those designs. And she is really an engaging person to chat with. I mean, she's been there behind the scenes for decades, since sort of the beginning of Max Creek. And, one of the topics that came up with her that I thought was just fascinating was, being a female in a rock and roll scene in the 70s and 80s. But I just thought that was such an engaging topic to explore. And so, I have a great draft of the book, and there's already a lot of work done on it. But as I navigate through this project, there are examples, like I just mentioned with Linda, that come up organically, and I'm all for that. Just recently, I was chatting with Greg DeGook, who I'm sure you know. I think he's been a guest on Hooked on Creek, and he's just a wonderful storyteller. And he'll just come out of the blue and be like, "Tom, I've got to tell you this one. Let's jump on a Zoom and chat about this." And he was recently telling me a story how the band did a gig in Connecticut back in the day, and Robert Hunter was on the bill, and he was backstage, sort of the backstage. So there was like this kitchen area, and he was just practicing his drums and stretching before the gig. And Robert Hunter and his wife walked in, and they just hit it off. And so when things like that come up, I'm like, boy, you have to include that in the book. So it's sort of an interesting project. I think most writers probably, conduct their research, finalize all their research and interviews and all of that sort of process, and then begin to write. And I'm sort of in this space where I'm doing both simultaneously, but it's working. So that's cool.
Will this book follow the band chronologically? Will it sort of start at the beginning and take you through the years, or does it like approach it from different perspectives? Or maybe you're not willing to share that yet. I don't know.
No, I'm happy to share that. And so, and I think there's going to be some great data that comes out of the research I've done too, that I'd love to share with the band and the community. So the book will certainly take a look at the 50 plus years of the band's history. It'll take a look at Camp Creek. It'll take a look at the studio albums as well. It'll take a look at the live performances. And of course, the fans and the community will be in the book as well. But every great story needs conflict, right? Some of the best stories ever written need conflict. And if you don't have conflict, it's pretty much a boring book. And it's conflict that makes people turn the pages, right? And I think everybody knows writers that are really good at that. People like Dan Brown, who wrote the Da Vinci Code, those just page burners, and J.K. Rowling, Stephen King, all of these famous writers, they do a really good job at exploring conflict. And one of the things, sort of the meat and potatoes of the book, that I am really interested in exploring is this sort of notion of the early 90s. There was an inflection point with the band. And so it was sort of interesting that in that early 90s scene, right around the time when the first Horde tour was sort of developing, you had these bands like Fish and Blues Traveler and Spin Doctors and others sort of propel themselves to the next level of their career and went on to have a lot of commercial success. And that didn't happen for Max Creek. And as a writer and a fan of the band, I'm really interested in uncovering why that happened. And obviously, like many things in life, there are lots of reasons things happen. And so I think it's going to be not only a great topic to explore for fans, but even for just music fans. Even if you're not a Creek freak, or maybe you just know Max Creek in passing, you're a fan of rock and roll, a fan of music, other genres, I think you're going to really sort of appreciate that exploration. I think it's going to be pretty fascinating. And it is interesting, some of the things I've sort of uncovered. I'm tackling the 50 years, the studio albums, the live recordings. And one of the things, too, I want to cover in the band that I've been drafting is this notion that not all jam bands are created equal. And I think writers have been lazy, right? And I think, it's just an easy term to coin, jam bands. But if you think about it, I mean, there are just so many genres of music and so many bands that get lumped into that genre or that label put on them that's just not indicative of what they do. For example, Blue Sky Green Grass is not the same as Fish, and Fish is not the same as The National, and The National is not the same as Ween, and Ween's not the same as Primus, and The Grateful Dead is not the same as Jefferson Airplane, and so the list goes on and on. But I think you get the drift, right? And I think writers who cover rock and roll and music in general have sort of been lazy and they haven't taken the time to explore that, right? If you look at other genres, if you look at heavy metal, not all heavy metal bands are created. So I think it's going to be fun to sort of break that down and explore some of those bands.
I'm reminded of what Eamon Cronin told me in my interview with him. He made a point to have me note that Max Creek is not a jam band. They're a band that jams. And so I think you're right. If you get lumped into this jam band, then it comes with a lot of baggage, and maybe that doesn't fit you very well. And I'd like to think that Max Creek has carved out sort of a place for themselves in this scene that very much distinguishes themselves from other bands, not only in the style of music they play, but just how they approach the music, having multiple people sing, multiple people write the songs, and just how they interact with the crowd and the scene is, to me, it makes them distinct, but that's my perspective, I guess.
No, that's great insight. And it's true, right? Like I've seen so many labels applied to Max Creek, whether it be country rock, psychedelic country rock, new bluegrass, new grass, dead tribute band, jam band, all of these different labels, some with a positive connotation, others not so much. And so, but this is a wonderful opportunity to sort of set that record straight and explore their music, right? I also think too, the Grateful Dead's legacy is just so significant and so impactful. I remember a time where people would think Max Creek was a Grateful Dead tribute band. Certainly not the case. And so I'm just so excited actually to finally be able to sort of explore these topics and, communicate my thoughts and love for the band. Yeah, I'm pretty excited about it.
Well, how long is it going to take for you to finish up this book? I'm kind of excited. I want to read it.
Yeah, so do I. I'll keep you posted. My initial plan for the project plan was 6 months of research and 1 year of writing. And so I could wrap the entire project up in about a year and a half. But interestingly enough, the interview process is really taking off. And so when something like that happens, I just can't not let it happen. And so it may take a little longer. I will certainly keep you posted, Korre. I'll certainly keep the Hooked on Creek audience posted. But I don't have a definitive date yet.
What is the name of this book going to be? Do you know yet?
I do have a working title, and the working title is Max Creek. Thanks for being here.
I love it. I absolutely love it. Well, I wonder, in all the research you're doing, are there any areas of the Max Creek community or history that you need help with? I mean, I don't know how many fans of Max Creek listen to the podcast. Some do. Is there anything we can do to help you?
Yes, absolutely. I'm so glad you asked. It's been interesting. Max Creek isn't documented like other bands. And there's certainly bands that sort of, grew up online and on the internet that are well documented. Like Fish is a perfect example, right? Like Fishnet and other platforms, that's a band that's incredibly well documented. And Creek was before that era. And so they're not as well documented as other bands. And so I've actually been working on a 50-year timeline that has milestones of each year that includes Camp Creek. I actually had to sort of uncover and build out a timeline of the 30 Camp Creeks that have happened. And like, even some of the band was like, oh gosh, Tom, you're asking me to remember things from the 70s and 80s, and if you remember the 70s and 80s, were you really there type of thing, building out timelines and building out Camp Creek timelines. Also, there are some gaps that I'm still looking to fill in. And there have been fans that have reached out to me and that have been really helpful. Just this Saturday, I was interviewing Mark Costa, who, by the way, has been a good friend of mine for decades. And he was with the band for 20 years. And just a great guy. He started doing monitors, doing sound, and was with the band for 20 years before moving on. And so had a great interview with him, and he was a good friend of mine even before he joined the Max Creek organization. So it's great to have somebody like that. I've also had the opportunity to chat with Annie Stackhouse. Annie's a longtime fan, close to the band, who's been instrumental in sort of arranging interviews with me. But I'd love to include some things like some photographs, some memories, some sort of first person point of view, just information about some of the festivals in the past. So I guess a good call to action would be if anybody's listening to this podcast, feel free to reach out to me. Maybe the best avenue for that is on the Hooked on Creek Facebook page. I mean, that's super simple. Everybody's on Facebook. I've asked some questions on that, gotten great responses. And so if you're cool with that, Korre, that works for me.
Yeah.
And I'd love if somebody has some information to share, some tidbit that has to be in the Max Creek book, most definitely reach out to me. I'm still sort of missing, set lists from early 80s. I'm missing some milestones here and there. Always have questions about some studio albums. And so more information, the better.
Yeah. Well, this is not the only book that you've ever written. And I'm curious, what are some of the other books that you've written, and how does this book or this project compare to some of the other things you've done?
Yeah, so my first book that I published is called The Potato Puff Surprise. It is a memoir about growing up in Rhode Island, particularly sort of during the junior high days. So I like to think of the book as sort of a cross between that old TV show, The Wonder Years, meets the movie Stand By Me. And so there's a lot of like junior high hijinks and shenanigans that happen. And the catalyst for the book was a friend of mine, my friend's dad, who actually gave me my first Grateful Dead album. He passed of cancer a few years back, and one of literally his dying wish was to have me write his eulogy. And so I did that, and it was an honor to write his eulogy. And when I did, so many people after the services came up to me and said, Tom, that would be a wonderful idea for a story. And so that's how the Potato Puff Surprise came to be. And there's actually an audio book for the Potato Puff Surprise as well. My last novel is called Acapulco, and if you're a fan of Stranger Things, this is the book for you. It's about a haunted lake in New England in the 1980s. And I actually had an opportunity to turn that into a Netflix series. It didn't ultimately work out, but wow, that was a wonderful learning experience. And so I'm also putting the finishing touches on a second novel. It's called Lav Rats, Lav Rats. It's about a garage rock band in the 90s, sort of a ghost story. So that's been great. And so, yeah, it's just something I love to do.
Yeah, I read Potato Puff Surprise, I think shortly after I met you at Camp Creek. I loved it. I would recommend it to anybody who's listening right now. If they want to get to know you, that might be a good way to start, right?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm so glad you enjoyed the book. I love that hearing feedback like that. And the audio book, of course, I had to record it. Like that had to have a Rhode Island accent. It had to have the Pawtucket accent. I would not have recorded Acapulco, but I certainly did the Potato Puff Surprise, and I will never listen to it again.
Well, let's take it back to Max Creek for a second. I'm curious, what are some of your favorite Max Creek songs?
Oh, I love this question. And so for me, by far, and this is an easy question for me, by far, my most favorite Max Creek song is Emerald Eyes. In my humble opinion, it is just a musical masterpiece. I really think that it showcases the entire band. Each musician gets an opportunity to shine on the song. I think it's the quintessential Max Creek song, right? It's got great verses. It has a great chorus. It has a great bridge. The hook is just, incredible. I think it's one of Scott's finest musical pieces. And there's a scene in Long Strange Trip, the Grateful Dead documentary, where the former Senator Al Franken, who's a huge Deadhead, talks about his love for Althea, and he has all these different versions of Althea. And I'm sort of the same way with Emerald Eyes. Like, I love the late 80s, early 90s Emerald Eyes. I love the versions before they incorporated the Peanuts theme into it. And so I have playlists of just Emerald Eyes.
Yeah. Also wondering, is there a specific Max Creek memory that stands out to you? Maybe it's from writing the book, or maybe it's from your experience of seeing the band over the years.
I think one of my favorite Max Creek concerts, I was a big fan of Buck Steep Manor. They used to play in Weston, Massachusetts every Labor Day weekend up at this place called Buck Steep. It was my favorite. I actually preferred it to Camp Creek. I just loved the camping. I loved the setting. the band was just so loose, and it was just amazing shows. And that 1991 Buck Steep Manor show, that set list is just fantastic. I feel like the band was in peak form back then. They would always have great opening acts play. I remember the Machine, who was a popular Pink Floyd tribute band, would play, and other bands as well. It was just a beautiful weekend, beautiful sort of quintessential New England concert weekend. So that was a great memory. Also, one of the things that I loved too was Camp Creek last year when you and I met each other in person. That was just a wonderful experience. I hadn't been to a Camp Creek in decades, never thought I'd get to go again. And not only did I get to go, but I went with friends that I used to go with back in the day. And so it's so cool that my Rhode Island friends still see Max Creek on a regular basis. And what I loved about it so much about it was such a special moment for me because I hadn't spoken to these friends in some time, years in some cases. And like, there was nothing awkward. We literally picked up where we left off. We literally drove to Connecticut from Rhode Island together. We set up the campsite, and it was just so great to spend the weekend with them. And it reminded me of just how friendly and how cool the Creek community is. Gosh, I think we forgot condiments, and within seconds, people were running over with ketchup and mustard and things, and just sharing everything. And it was just an amazing scene. So I used to love Buck Steep Manor. Last year's Camp Creek was awesome. And, back then when I was in high school, it was such a life-changing scene, something I had never sort of seen before, something I had never participated in before. And then, just as life happens, going every single Wednesday, 8 times a month or so, you just get to see the same people every show, and then you make friends, and then you make lifelong friends. And so those are the moments I think about, just all the close friends that I met, and what just an amazing time to be alive back then. And so those are some of the things I reflect on when I think of my favorite moments with Max Krieg.
Music is such a powerful thing, and you're a writer, so I'm wondering your perspective on the role of music in popular culture, or the role in music as a place you could take yourself, your own mind, or your own emotions, and how it connects people together. It seems to have such a heavy influence, or it could have a heavy influence in so many people's lives. And I'm wondering, how do you perceive music as far as influencing you or kind of popular culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's magical, right? And so, it really does have, magic in it, right? And so, for most people, the soundtrack of their lives is music, right? You're driving down the road and a song comes on, whether it's on Spotify, Apple Music, maybe you're listening to the radio and it's a song from 20 years ago, and you're instantly transported back in that moment of time where that song resonated with you, which is fascinating. I can't think of lots of things in life that do that. I mean, it's just so experiential, right? And it doesn't matter what genre of music you are, you know what I mean? It's tribal, for Max Creek, you have, not to be stereotypical, but you may have people, who love improvisational music. They love the culture from the 60s, that Woodstock culture. They love that hippie lifestyle, that creative outlet. And once you're in that tribe, it's like wearing a uniform or a badge. And that's applicable whether you're into bluegrass, whether you're into noise rock, whether you're into heavy metal, shoegaze, like whatever that is, you find your tribe. That music is magical. And yeah, now you've actually given me something I want to explore in the book. That's a great question.
Well, Tom, if anybody wants to learn more about you, where can they find you, or how can they get connected with you?
Yeah, they can visit my website. It is tflan.com. Super easy. That's just TFLAN.com. And I encourage everybody to sign up for my newsletter. I send a weekly newsletter. It typically focuses on topics like my writing and very nerdy music. I'm a music nerd, and so I cover a lot of that stuff, and that's where I'll be providing updates for the Max Creek book. So just visit tflan.com, hit that subscribe button right on the homepage, and that would be cool.
Well, Tom Flanagan, thank you so much for joining me on Hooked on Creek. I had so much fun talking with you.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, Korre.
All right, that concludes my conversation with Tom Flanagan. Huge thanks again to Tom for joining me on the podcast. It was a lot of fun talking with him, and now I'm really looking forward to his new book. Tom is a beautiful writer. I've read his book, Acapulco, and his book, The Potato Puff Surprise. Both are excellent, so I encourage you to check them out. In the episode show notes, you can find a link to Tom's website, tflan.com, to learn more about Tom and his books. If you are curious, during the introduction to this episode, I played a portion of Emerald Eyes, Tom's favorite Max Creek song. That version of Emerald Eyes was recorded live December 23rd, 1989, at the Living Room in Providence, Rhode Island. If you have feedback about this episode, please head over to the Hooked on Creek website at hookedoncreek.com and click the contact link to send me a message. I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks for tuning in.